This is Origin Stories, a podcast by Shetland Amenity Trust for Shetland Wool Week. I'm Carol Christiansen, Curator at Shetland Museum and Archives. Origin Stories will investigate the earliest evidence for textile-related themes in Shetland's history and prehistory. Along the way, we'll look at some of the more important points of Shetland's textile story, discussing why things happened and perhaps do a bit of myth-busting along the way. Today we'll investigate the origin of knitting in Shetland, the historical and physical evidence, following the path as far back as we can. We know that Shetlanders have been weaving cloth since the late Bronze Age or early Iron Age, about 3,500 years ago. Weaving cloth from Shetland wool has continued to the present day. But some time ago, knitting was introduced into Northern Europe and found its way to Shetland. The direction and period it traveled to arrive has several possibilities. And because knitted garments traveled very easily and were very useful to anyone sailing the North Sea, we must be conscious of knitted garments that may have come from elsewhere and not actually knitted in Shetland. The most often cited reference to the beginnings of knitting in Shetland is the story of the shipwrecked Spanish Armada crew on Fair Isle. This occurred in 1588. We will come back to this account in more detail later. First, let's look at some slightly later but more sound historical sources. As Linda Fryer points out in her excellent book, Knitting by the Fireside and on the Hillside, the first reference to the practice of knitting taking place in Shetland is from 1618, exactly 30 years after the Spanish landed on Fair Isle. Here it is described that women in Shetland knitted mittens and stockings, which the Hollanders and the English do buy for rarity. Not only does this description identify knitting being practiced in Shetland, but it's the first mention of Dutch and English fishermen buying knitwear as a tourist would do. Certainly these were wearable and useful garments, but the phrase, do buy for rarity, implies these items were taken home as gifts or to be worn by the fisherman himself once he was back at his home port, as a memento from his work abroad. This trade with fishermen would continue for another 300 years, and still continues today as part of tourism. There's a reference 3 years earlier, in October 1615, in which two men named Magnus and Olaf stole a black ewe from Marion in Walls and made one pair of stockings from the wool. They were found guilty by a jury and were made to march from the gate of Scalawa Castle to West Shore and back, a distance of about a mile, while being whipped. They were also banished from living in their parish, and if they were caught stealing again, they would be hanged without trial. What we don't know is if they knitted the stockings or sewed them from woven fabric made from the wool they stole. The court uses the word made, which in English is ambiguous as to how they were made. But this may have been an anglicized usage of the Shetland word maak, which is the term used for knitting. And because only one pair are noted, it is more likely they were knitted rather than woven, which would have been a more time-consuming process. There are many more references in this period to stealing sheep to remove the wool, or simply stealing wool by plucking it from the animal and selling or trading it. The impression is that wool was in short supply and that ready money could be made if you could get your hands on some, which suggests that knitting was being practiced and items quickly made and sold to visiting merchants and fishermen. These references for the first quarter of the 17th century seem a bit late for knitting to have finally arrived in Shetland. Evidence of knitting in places near to Shetland date considerably earlier, as much as 100 years. A fragment of knitting and stocking stitch was found in excavations in Bergen, Norway, with a date somewhere between 1476 and 1525. Bergen was Shetland's main trading port, and there was regular communication and movement of goods across the North Sea in this period. The sailing takes about 30 hours one way, and Hanseatic merchants and traders were regularly taking cargo back and forth. There is also an entry in a Bergen ledger for a pair of knitted stockings made in the Faroe Islands, belonging to a man executed in 1567. In the same ledger are recorded 20 pairs of knitted stockings bought in the Faroe Islands. So here we have references to knitting in Bergen and Faroe considerably before the solid evidence for it being in Shetland by 1620. It is likely that if knitting was practiced in Norway and Faroe by the middle of the 16th century, it would also be known in Shetland by the same time. Now let's turn to the story of the Armada shipwreck on Fair Isle. In the summer of 1588, the Spanish crown mounted a naval attack on England to invade the country, assassinate Protestant Queen Elizabeth I, and put an end to English interference in Spanish shipping and trade. The battles took place in the English Channel, but as things began to fall apart for the Spanish, many of their ships sailed to the North Sea to escape. The idea was to round Britain to the north, then sail south to Spain. But they did not figure on the weather, the difficult sailing conditions, and their inability to identify landing places to get fresh water. One of the Spanish ships, the El Gran Griffin, was the main supply ship for the battle. It tried various times over the course of 6 weeks, along with several other Spanish ships, to find its way out of the waters between Shetland, Orkney, and the Western Isles. By the time it saw Fair Isle through bad weather on the 27th of September, it had 200 of its own crew and 40 crew members picked up from its companion boats that had wrecked. The most difficult problem was that they had run out of fresh water. Their supplies had been ruined by seawater from 40 holes in the hull of the ship that it sustained during the battle. The next day, it was driven into a narrow, deep-sided channel on Fair Isle's eastern side where it sank. The masts and rigging were used as ladders to allow the men to scramble off the ship. No lives were lost, but their supplies were, and the men took only Spanish coins in their escape. The Fair Islanders were faced with having to feed and care for 240 men in autumn when supplies would have been plentiful, but not enough to keep all of them throughout the winter. The Spanish paid for the food they ate, although the coinage would not have been very useful to the Fair Islanders until rents were due the following summer. Unfortunately, their timing couldn't have been worse. Autumn is the stormiest time of year in Shetland, and word of what was happening on Fair Isle took a month to reach help. The men were stranded in Fair Isle for at least 6 weeks, and 50 died of hunger. They were eventually picked up in boats, taken to Orkney, and then on to Anstruther near Edinburgh. Here they were described at the time as beardless, weak, exhausted, and hungry. In other words, very young and very poorly. The stories of knitting in this scenario run along 2 lines: that the colorful patterns in Fair Isle knitting made in the 19th century were Spanish in origin, and that the crew taught the islanders how to knit. Many of the crew probably did wear pieces of knitwear, especially stockings and caps, but these would not have been fancy garments, simply plain workwear. Some of them may have known how to knit, because sailors are traditionally very skilled in handiwork, especially sewing and rope work since they had to mend sails. But none of these early references mention what happened as they waited to be rescued. The evidence points to the need to be fed and gain strength, perhaps helping the islanders with crops or fishing if their strength allowed. And as we have seen from other evidence, it's probably also the case that Fair Islanders already knew how to knit by 1588. In addition to this, the patterns found in Fair Isle knitting are more similar to those from Scandinavia and the Baltic than they are to Spanish patterns. Knitters on Farell were more likely to have been inspired with knitting brought back from the centuries-old Hanseatic trade links between Shetland, Norway, and the Baltic region than they were to 6 weeks sharing food with Spanish sailors. Now let's look at some physical evidence, pieces of knitting that have been found at an archaeological site. Only 5 samples have been found, and these are very fragmentary, so much so that it is not possible to tell what garments they represent. They come from a site to the west of Shetland, but the date range for the level where they were found is between about 1400 and to the early 1600s. Since knitting in Shetland was documented by the early 1600s, the date for these pieces is likely to be at the end of this period. 3 fragments were made from white wool and 2 from natural colored wool. They were all made from plied yarn and not very fine, mainly DK weight, with the thickest similar to Aran weight. The largest piece has a cast-on edge. All are in stocking stitch, and some have areas of decreasing or increasing. One small circular fragment is knit in the round and is similar to the crown of a cap. These fragments do not tell us much more about the origins of knitting in Shetland, but their coarse structure gives us an idea of what some knitting looked like, at least by the early 1600s. They were probably everyday garments, made rather quickly and worn until no longer useful. They are a far cry from the dyed and patterned knitting or the extremely fine lace knitting that developed later. Finally, I'll discuss some of the knitting associated with the Gunister Man find. In 1951, the remains of an individual were found buried by 2 men cutting peat for fuel. The remains were exhumed and taken to the National Museum in Edinburgh because there was no museum in Shetland at that time. Coins in the little purse dated the remains to about 1700. The finds included a full suit of woolen clothing, a very worn and patched outer jacket, a suit consisting of short, wide breeches, and a tailored long coat with wide, turned-up cuffs, a fitted bodice, and a wide skirt covering the breeches. The suit was worn over a buttoned front shirt. The knitted accessories to this outfit were 2 caps, a pair of stockings, one of which had been repaired with another stocking, a purse, a pair of gloves, and a small patterned fragment. There were also tiny patches made from knitting inside the jacket. In 2009, Shetland Museum made a replica of this clothing for its permanent display. The National Museum in Edinburgh kindly allowed us access to the original garments, and we studied the quality of the wools, the spinning, the woven and knitted patterns, and the tailoring and finishing of the garments. Not knowing where Gunister Man came from, we wanted to test whether we could make all 22 different fabrics from Shetland wool. We came close. It was only the 2 caps that had certain qualities to them which pointed to a non-Shetland origin. In the end, they were made with a mixture of Shetland and Norwegian wool. It's interesting to look at the construction of these caps because they have some novel and inventive details. Both of the caps were white. One had a brim and was slightly coarser wool than the other. The cap without a brim was found in a pocket wrapped around a horn spoon and seemed older than the other cap. It was very softly felted around the lower edge, suggesting it had been tugged on and handled extensively. We have tentatively identified this as a sleeping cap. The other cap was found on the head and had a turned-up brim made with a textured stitch pattern. Both caps had the same crown construction, 6 bands, 4 stitches wide, where decreases were made either side of the bands, ending at the crown. Similar crown constructions have been found in caps worn by Dutch whalers to Svalbard. Both caps had been fulled after knitting. Fulling was a typical method of finishing knitting, as it was for woven fabrics. In fact, it was decreed in Shetland in a document known as the amendments to the Country Acts from 1725 that knitted garments had to be fulled before they were sold. The finished garment is lightly wetted or washed, agitated somewhat to soften and fluff the wool, and allowed to shrink a little. It's then usually put on a form to dry. What was interesting about the possible nightcap was that it had small loops of wool on the inside. The purl stitches had bubbled up and looked like a very low-pile boucle effect. We aimed to understand how this was done, and after many experiments with preparing and spinning different wools, knitting to different gauges, and fulling to different extents, we determined that the wools were caused by very smoothly prepared and spun wool, knit somewhat loosely, and then fulled quite extensively. This caused the stitches to tighten and some of the smooth wool fibers to spring out in loops. Whether this was an intentional construction is not known, but having an inner surface of wool loops would have given this cap added insulation against the cold. We do not know where the knitwear belonging to Gunister Man originated. He appeared to be a traveling clerk and may have picked up items of clothing on his travels. He would have encountered knitwear for sale in Shetland certainly by the year 1700, when knitting had been well established by then. His knitted accessories show how well developed knitting was in the North Sea region by the beginning of the 18th century. Many different garments were being knitted, and decorative stitching and quality workmanship was being practiced by local people who sold or traded their knitting to customers. This kind of knitting was practical, well made, with a touch of design interest. These qualities continue to be the hallmark of Indigenous knitting in Shetland and beyond well into the 21st century. Gunister Man reminds us, buy handmade, support local producers. Thank you for listening today, and I hope you are able to join us in Shetland sometime soon.